Hi, I'm Miss Bovey.
And I'm Miss Hardy, and today we're going to be talking you through the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. So we're going to start with the scientific revolution, which is really one of the major causes for the later Enlightenment. And so we're going to start off with our first true revolutionary scientist that most historians place at the beginning of this time period of the scientific revolution.
But let's put some context on this period to begin with and recognize that the scientific revolution is typically seen as starting around 1600. And at this point, the Renaissance has sort of come to an end, and this rise of new scientific thought really pushes forward the next time period that we're going to be looking at.
Yes, absolutely. So what we're going to see in these early scientists is really a blend of science and religion in terms of how they perceive their achievements and even when they publish them. So Copernicus is our first main scientist, and he's the one that figures out in Europe that the Earth is not the center of the universe as the old Ptolemaic view of the universe was, but instead it was the sun, so this heliocentric view of the universe. This was later confirmed by Kepler, who agreed that there were elliptical orbits. So the Copernican view said that there were circular orbits, and Kepler comes through and goes, no, in fact, they are elliptical orbits. And this is our current view of the universe today. Both of these are then supported by Galileo, who was sort of, as you kids would call it, the Bill Nye of the science world during the scientific revolution. And so although Copernicus himself won't publish any of his findings until he's on his deathbed for fear of retribution from the Catholic Church, Galileo does publish his approval and support of Copernicus and Kepler in his dialogues, in which it really is a sarcastic conversation that kind of denotes that only someone ill-educated would agree that the earth was the center of the universe. And the Catholic Church, the Inquisition, does call him down for a trial. He is forced to recant and then is put under house arrest for the rest of his days, so he does not publish any further scientific finding, even though he himself was a devout Catholic.
So the question I'm sure you're asking yourself is, why would the church feel threatened by this concept, this scientific concept that the earth was not the center of the universe? That doesn't, I know right now, might not make any sense to you. So why, Miss Hardy, is that the case?
So during this time period, the Catholic Church is going through a bit of turmoil. So backing up a bit, the Catholic Church used to be a huge powerhouse during the Middle Ages. However, that power starts to dwindle. Plus, with the addition of the Renaissance creating more power in the hands of monarchs and less power away from the church, the initial reaction is any type of fact or new science that contradicts Catholic Church teachings really brings up a lot of tension and history with the Protestant Reformation, taking away power from the Catholic Church, the monarchs who are taking away power from the Catholic Church. And so any type of denouncing what the Catholic Church doctrine would have said, even something as minor as the earth is the center versus the sun is the center, it's something that they're going to take very seriously.
So you're telling me that the church is just threatened, that if people start to recognize that major scientific thought, if the church was incorrect about that, then perhaps the church might be further incorrect in other ways. So they'd rather crack down on anything that contradicts their current teaching in order to sort of save face, if you will.
Absolutely. What a great way to analyze the point of view of the Catholic Church during this time period.
And this is what you'll see a lot of times that the Catholic Church does through their history, is that it's a lot of reactionary measurements at the time to sort of deal with things that they can't explain themselves, and so they come up with an alternate explanation for.
Absolutely. So we're going to move to some of our other scientists that really make up the height of the scientific revolution. And so our first one, we have William Harvey, and he also discovers that blood circulated through the body using veins and arteries. So Ms. Bovey, my question to you is this the first time something like this has ever been discovered in history?
Actually, no. The Islamic world during the post-classical period, really, they make the greatest advancements in medical knowledge. Ibn Sina was one of the most famous medical doctors during the post-classical period within the Islamic world, and he trained other physicians and things like that in Baghdad, which was the capital of the Abbasid dynasty.
So our next scientist that we're going to cover is Francis Bacon. So Francis Bacon comes up with what you would know as the scientific method, but in AP World History, we really call this idea empiricism. So the idea that you are going to base what you believe on what you can observe, not on something that had been previously taught to you. So this is where you come up with the idea of having a theory to make a prediction. You do an experiment to see if your observations match what your theory holds, or if you need to modify your original theory in the first place. I mean, we even see this in history. How we choose and how we make our arguments valid is by showing those same processes can be seen in different eras in history. That's where we get our synthesis point from in the first place. So we see the effects of Francis Bacon, even though he has a cool-ass name, throughout the rest of world history.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to let Miss Bovey pronounce René Descartes' name the correct way, as I am not adept with a French accent.
You said it correctly. René Descartes.
I'm so proud of myself. So René Descartes' famous quote is, "I think, therefore I am." So he argues for this sense of skepticism, to question everything until you can prove it. And so René would ask questions like, why? So if he were to ask you a simple question, Miss Hardy, what are you staring at? A microphone. Why is that a microphone? Well, because it's picking up my voice and transmitting it to the computer so all my little WHAP students can understand this podcast. Well, how do you know that it's picking up the sound? Why is it doing that? Why? And so the whole idea is he gets to this root idea of, if you ask yourself why enough, you have to question your own reality. And so he says, I think, because I think and I have cognitive abilities, therefore I can prove that I myself exist. And if I can prove that I myself exist, I can then move forward and prove everything else correct.
Well, and one of the reasons that you're going to see in our feedback on your essays and other things we do in this class will follow this sort of model. We'll always ask why, so what? As you develop your arguments in your essay, that is the process. You're trying to explain that so what. You're trying to explain why. And if you can think of René Descartes as you do this, and that process of the scientific revolution, that's just a fun connection.
Absolutely.
So all of this will lead to the development of scientific knowledge will have the greatest impact, I think, as far as the way that we want to look at it for world history on a period known as the Enlightenment. Because scientists, because they've come up with these new laws, intellectuals begin to apply those laws, the natural laws, to progress within government and society as well, and begin to ask those questions. If I can apply the scientific method to a scientific process, could I apply it to something else in the real world? And what are the ramifications of this application?
Absolutely. And so the question that we always ask is, why are these philosophers applying the scientific method to politics? What's going on there that might cause room for questioning of authority?
And the first most important thing that we're going to highlight, which was sort of one of the key aspects of the tail end of the early modern period, is the rise of absolute monarchies. And of course, we see our best example of that comes with King Louis XIV's reign in France, with the construction of the Palace of Versailles, this massive palace that he forces the nobles to come and sort of, fawn around him at all times and show his power. I mean, his famous quote is, "L'État c'est moi," I am the state, I am the government, and that to define me is defy God himself, the idea that God has divinely appointed him to rule. And I think it works in his favor in one way, the fact that he reigns for so long, he can continue to use that as justification for any decision he makes as part of his reign.
Absolutely, but we're going to see some issues arise, especially in France, in which their monarchs abuse their power and abuse the power of the purse, the power of the treasury. And when that starts to affect the lower classes, the peasants, and even the middle class with your philosophers or your philosophes, as we call them in France, that's going to lead to that questioning of the authority and questioning of what is the role of government and how can we use the idea of empiricism to prove new theories of political rule correct. So, though while in continental Europe and France, we're starting to see this rise of absolutism, in England, we actually see an opposing thing occur, which is an interesting dichotomy in world history. And so in England during this time, we have what's called the Glorious Revolution. So essentially, a little background, after Elizabeth I passes, her uncle James II comes to the throne, and he is Catholic, and so in fear of having a Catholic line of monarchs, they go to William and Mary of Orange, and the Parliament asks them to come back over. Please come back over. We will make you monarchs, but we want to have the power. Parliament wants to have the power. So William and Mary of Orange, they come back over to England. They are put in place as the monarchs. However, it's glorious because there's no bloodshed, of course. But in this time, Parliament says, look, we're going to take the power of the purse. You as monarchs will give you an allowance, but you are not going to have as much political power as we do. We control the treasury, and thus we hold the true seat of power in England.
Now, why is there such a huge difference between England and France? And why does the Parliament have this kind of established power that they can set these rules in England, whereas they're not able to do that in France?
I think it goes back to one of the big turning points in world history, which is the creation of the Magna Carta in 1215. So the idea of that the monarch is not above Parliament, and even to pass taxes, you must go through Parliament. So they've had a history of parliamentary rule in England that's been very successful for them, whereas in France and their parliamentary structure, the Estates General has been fairly inconsistent in its rule and in its power in regards to their relationship with monarchs.
And the other thing that will happen is that the king will actually shut down the Estates General and not call them, meaning that the Parliament will in fact have, well, there won't be a Parliament, and it'll last for more than 100 years. And the next time that we see the emergence of the Parliament again will be right on the eve of revolution.
Well, as a way to prevent that French Revolution from occurring, Louis XVI does it as his last final plea, like, oh, I'll bring back the Estates General, but it's just too little too late.
Yep.
So now we're going to move on to the Enlightenment. So we've kind of given you some background on why the scientific revolution will cause it, and then what's happening in Europe to bring about a need to change politics. And so this Enlightenment is really an intellectual movement. We'll see a lot of philosophers called philosophes in France, and they come up with different ideas about how government should run. Now we'll begin with our English philosopher John Locke.
Well, and I think the other thing I want to point out is the fact that what I love about the period of Enlightenment in Europe is that it will radically change everything. And not just within Europe, but you're going to see its application move across the pond to the Americas and will be the spark of the revolutions that we're going to be talking about in a few podcasts to come. And if I was looking at a turning point in history as what really defines this radical shift, to me it would be the creation of the Enlightened thinker, because today we still feel the ramifications for ideas that were written by Locke. So Locke is really one of the most fundamental individuals that focuses in his treatise on government, his most famous writing. Really, he comes forward with the idea that we have natural rights, life, liberty, and property, and that just because you are human, you should have the ability to have those three things. And that any sort of government that's been created has been created simply because we have given them authority to have power over us.
So what happens then if a government does not protect humans' natural rights? What then do the people need to do?
Well, in Locke's opinion, that you rise up against that creation. Because if that government, which you've given power to make a decision on your behalf, is not doing what's in your best interest, then you have the right to change it. Because it is not natural. Governments are not naturally derived. They are constructs of man.
Absolutely, and this kind of goes back to one of two modes of thought that we'll see in Enlightenment thinkers, and it goes back to their view of man as a whole. So some of our Enlightenment philosophers, like John Locke, believe that on their own, without government, man is naturally good. However, we'll see with some varying philosophers that that's not the case, and their view of man, and if humankind on their own is good or bad, that will really determine how they view the government's role in regards to their relationship and their protection of people.
So with that being the case, with Locke being one of those individuals that see man as naturally good, Thomas Hobbes, who is also an English philosopher, basically feels the opposite, that man is born wicked. and that we need to have absolute rulers to have a firm hand to control those people. Now, if I was making a synthesis connection right now to this topic, where else in history have we seen someone believe that man is naturally evil?
I think we could go back to classical China with the creation of the Qin dynasty with Qin Shi Huangdi, who bases his rule off of legalism, this idea that people on their own are not good, and thus they need a very strict, firm emperor who imposes a series of harsh punishments and rewards for his people.
So Hobbes' basic argument is that people's natural state was to live in a bleak world in which life was nasty, brutish, and short. But however, if you agreed to a social contract that gave up some of your rights to an absolute monarch, you would therefore, in return, be given law and order. Seems like a pretty nice thing. People are nasty, you give up a few of your rights, you get law and order, and society will function properly.
It should be of no surprise that Thomas Hobbes was often celebrated by many an absolute monarch in continental Europe during this time.
Yay, Hobbes!
Yay! He looks so pleasant in his picture.
Where, if you can imagine, if Hobbes believed that way, Locke was just the opposite, that argued that the social contract implied the right, and therefore you could rise up against your government, like we already said.
So our next philosopher we're going to talk about is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Is that close to the
That's
French?
pretty close.
I'm very happy with that. So Rousseau, who is also known as my history boyfriend, has this idea of a social contract. So the social contract we've seen with Hobbes, we've seen with Locke. It's really what the government must do in return for the people following that government structure. So Rousseau says that instead of just protecting the right to life, liberty, and property, instead, the government really should follow the general will of the people. So if the majority of people want your government to be moving in a certain direction, then the government needs to follow the will of the people. And if the government stops following the general will of the people, then the people, the citizens, have the right to rise up and try to reform their governments.
So Rousseau is often considered a pre-romantic because his work seems to rebel against the social and political privileges of the French aristocracy, as well as against scientific rationalism. One of Rousseau's early works was a book entitled Emile, or On Education, in which he laid out his ideas on child rearing and education. Interesting fact, though, people in France still use that particular book as the basis foundation for how they raise children today.
Wow.
So you know that book has some legs if people 200-300 years later are still using it as the basis for how children are raised.
And what a great piece of evidence for why the Enlightenment is such a turning point. You're talking about effects that don't just occur in the political revolutions, but we can see traced through today.
Absolutely. And Rousseau really gives revolutionaries of the late 18th century hope of establishing better governments. Where Locke says you should and Hobbes says, well, we need strong leaders, Rousseau sort of couples that Locke idea and says, there is hope, we can create a better future.
So our other philosophes during this time, one of my favorites is Voltaire.
Oh, mine too.
Really? How interesting. So Voltaire was this really lovely philosopher who gives us a lot of our roots in the idea of freedom of speech and religion, as well as the separation of church and state. He was famous for his satires, and in fact, his satires were so famous, he would often be kicked out of France for fear of the government coming to arrest him.
Yes, he's exiled for 3 years due to conflict with a member of the French aristocracy, and he spends a lot of time traveling through Europe. And he's quite beloved of other famous leaders of this time. Catherine the Great loved Voltaire.
Oh, they were pen pals, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so he had other people really appreciated him, even if his own country was not so fond of his writings. One of the things that sort of stands out to me with Voltaire is his concept of freedom of speech and religion. And he's the first person really that says that church and state need to be separated. If you're going to have a government, it should not be coupled with people's religious beliefs, because inherently in that, there are too many conflicts that will arise.
I think that brings up a really great point in this shift of religious thought. So in the scientific revolution, most of our scientists were still devout Catholics, but we're going to see during the Enlightenment is really the rise of something called deism. So during this, the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason inspired new attempts among intellectuals to establish the relationships of humans to God, or at least to God's natural world. So what the deists do is they argue that God created the world and then kind of stepped back to observe its movements according to the natural laws. I wonder where they got that from. That could be discovered by scientific inquiry. So what this deists do, you've heard the example before of the clockmaker. So the idea that there's a deity that comes in, they set up the world, they set up the structure, and then they step back. So we're going to see this in the Enlightenment with the idea of freedom of speech and religion. People no longer tie their scientific or political thought to religion. And so we see that in this movement of deism that kind of takes a step back from Christianity that we've seen in the centuries prior.
So deist relationship to God is impersonal and theoretical, where Christians are still focused on miracles and faith. But nevertheless, many of the deists view regular church attendance as important social obligations and moral guides for societies. So they would still argue, yes, you want to go to church, but the actual belief that God is going to come down and have a miraculous intervention on your life, they would not condone or believe that such thing would happen or take place.
So it seems really interesting that we go from Catholicism and Christianity being so important both in the Middle Ages and in the Protestant and Counter-Reformations, and yet we move to this sense of deism during the Enlightenment. I wonder if we could trace back that development of deism through European intellectual life back through the Middle Ages.
That's a great point, Ms. Hardy. Let's see how that development takes place. I would say that it starts with medieval scholasticism and the important work of St. Thomas Aquinas, who lived during the 13th century. And one of the things that he does is he uses reason and faith to debate faith or to defend faith, and argues this through writing and debating. And his primary sort of reference in that is Aristotle, which is the first time that you're going to see a significant Catholic Church member using ancient or classic works to help support current Catholic beliefs.
And I think we could even trace that idea of classicism with Aristotle through the Renaissance with the idea of humanism, the idea that we're focused on human achievements and human accomplishments instead of the spiritual realm. And so I think when you look at authors like Machiavelli with The Prince, we start seeing this focus on what humans could do instead of focusing more on the spirituality of religion like we've seen during the medieval times.
So it only makes sense that we would get to this point, that if over a series of hundreds of years we go from, well, using classical authors to defend faith, and then getting to the idea of, well, if God created us, then we must be important, so why don't we focus on what we're capable of doing, to the idea of, well, could we rationalize this out? Can we use empirical data to prove something? And then can we apply that to other areas like government and politics? And I can see where the belief in deism, or the idea that God exists, but is sort of stepped back and we are sort of at our own whims to creating how the world works.
Absolutely. So when we get to this stage, Montesquieu, one of our deists, he is really of particular importance, especially when we look later to the Constitution writers of the United States, or the newly formed United States. And so he has a very famous work called The Spirit of Laws, which praised the British government and their use of the checks of power by means of Parliament. So Montesquieu goes further. And he says that we need to separate out the three branches of government, and that each of those branches of government needs to have an ability to check or balance the power, so you don't have an absolute monarch controlling your government. Instead, you have different branches that will balance each other out and who should be chosen by the people.
And this is really important, because if any one part of the government has too much power, then it's too often that corruption can set in and the system will break down, and that's what they're trying to avoid. So if it's set up properly and you can check the power of another entity, then you can create something that will work well for the people.
I agree. So we're going to talk about really one of our only true ladies of the Enlightenment, Mary Wollstonecraft, who has a very famous daughter, Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein.
Which I hope you pay attention to some about what we're going to tell you about Miss Mary Wollstonecraft.
So Mary Wollstonecraft, she writes a particularly important text called A Vindication of the Rights of Women that really talks about how women need to be involved in politics. They need to have a political say. how revolutionary is it for this time period?
That's really revolutionary. Now, let's be honest though, women for a long time have wanted to have participation in government. You'll go, if we want to even go a little farther back to Queen Elizabeth I, the reason why she makes a point of remaining single her whole life and claiming that she is married to her country is that she recognizes that being seen solely as a woman is one of her greatest weaknesses, because men are only seen as strong, powerful. But I love that Wollstonecraft is arrived at a time that we have a powerful Tsarina that's controlling Russia.
Catherine the Great.
Yes, Catherine the Great. You have women like Abigail Adams in the United States that is writing letters to her husband while he's participating in the Continental Congress that says and declares, remember the ladies, like, make us a part of the discussion that you're having.
So really with economics, we really only talk about one person, Adam Smith. So he writes his book, The Wealth of Nations. The same year, America declares its independence from Great Britain. And he writes in it that government should stay out of economics, stay out of the marketplace. And this is a direct reform of mercantilism, really the economic system beloved by absolute monarchs. And he said instead of forcing in the government putting their hand in, he believed that this idea of laissez-faire or hands-off, or the government getting out of economics. We call this capitalism today. And he said that really when you're going through the marketplace and trying to set price and using your supply and demand, that government doesn't need to be involved, that there's this invisible hand of the marketplace that naturally will determine price based on human variables, and that we don't need to actively have a hand in it.
The important thing that I want to point out here is, as Ms. Hardy said, that 1776 is a pivotal year for the United States, because that's when the Declaration of Independence is written, and that's when Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations is published. And the fact that both things come out in the same year is just one of those wonderful curiosities of history that I like to talk about. And the two founding principles of the United States will be democracy, and the second thing will be capitalism. And both of those will emerge because of these two documents that just so-and-so happened at the same time.
So one of the great things we see is that some of our absolute monarchs will become what we call enlightened despots. And so these enlightened despots like to use this idea of being an absolute ruler, but do it in terms of helping their people and using the ideals of the Enlightenment in that. And so we see it with Frederick the Great of Prussia. He himself was a classically trained musician. He, one of his greatest quotes is, the greatest and noblest pleasure which we have in this world is to discover new truths. And the next is to shake off old prejudices.
Then we have Miss Catherine the Great, who is actually a German princess who comes and is brought over to be the wife of who will be the next Tsar of Russia. Fortunately, after they got married, she arranges to have him killed, although that's still on the down low. No one can guarantee that she had any hand in her husband's death.
Her boyfriend did not have any help with her husband's death.
But, she does give birth to only one heir and runs effectively this absolute throne, and really brings Russia to its most largest boundaries, greatest power in its entire history will be under the reign of Catherine the Great.
I love this quote by Catherine the Great because, she was a pen pal of Voltaire. And even at one point, she created an entire model village with serfs that were free. And it was a fake village, just done to impress her Enlightenment philosopher friends. And during this time, she gives the political control of these serfs over to the boyars, over to these Russian nobles. She rids herself of them. And so I love this quote that she has, and I always read it in my Southern accent because it drips with the Southern sarcasm and the passive aggressiveness we've come to love here in the South. And so I say, you philosophers are lucky men. You write on paper, and paper is patient. Unfortunate empress that I am, I write on the susceptible skins of living beings. Bless your heart. Let's go inside and have some sweet tea. Talk about it.
I can just picture her right now doing that. That's
I know,
awesome.
as she's actually speaking in Russian.
The social gatherings of Europeans intellectuals took place in something called salons, which were essentially the homes of the rich and the famous. As hostesses, some women made their marks on the 18th century by bringing together artists, politicians, philosophers, and popular writers who would were able to sit down and have these really fascinating discussions with each other. Essentially, they threw like the world's best dinner parties.
Oh, man.
And they were the ones that sort of established that. And so as these people sat together, they could debate and argue and sort of refine their thoughts before they went and actually published what they were. And this is where they became sort of centers. Coffee houses will become sort of the new economic centers of thinking. That's where the economists will go and sort of shoot the breeze, if you will, and debate and discuss and pass papers back and forth. And so salons and coffee houses are the two sort of like linchpins of both the economic and the Enlightenment movement of this time period.
Absolutely. And you can totally see the historical tracing of the coffee house as this place of discussion. Even today, if you walk into a coffee house, you are meant to have a cup of coffee and sit and speak to other people and have conversations about politics, economics, philosophy. These are the places in which you idealize these conversations occurring.
Right. So as we wrap up our podcast, let's try to make some connections to our historical thinking skills. And so the two we want to focus on is synthesis and causation. Let's look at causation first.
So when we look at this, we're going to be looking at the scientific revolution. So we've already traced the idea of how the scientific revolution caused the Enlightenment to occur, especially with Francis Bacon's idea of empiricism, using the scientific method to prove scientific theorems and to observe the world. And so we see that applied in the Enlightenment. We are taking the scientific method, the idea of empiricism, and applying it to the political realm. And this, coupled with the absolutism, the absolute monarchs, really give our Enlightenment philosophers a lot of good fodder for conversation.
The last thing, and let's make our synthesis connection, is that I want to point out that because Western Europe will rise up in power after the early modern period and during this particular time period, that sort of the narrative that gets established is that West is the best. And because the West takes over so many other territories and regions of the world, that's what gets stamped. But it's important to note that lots of the discoveries and knowledge that the Europeans will independently come up with have already been discovered other places in the world, most notably in the Islamic world during the post-classical era. This is when the world of Dar al-Islam, the scientific knowledge and the growth of medicine and all of those things were already happening. Ideas like the heliocentric theory,
Gravity.
all of these things take place in Islam first, but that knowledge, not all of that knowledge is transmitted to Europe. And so the fact that Europeans will later discover this on their own, publish that, and then because they're so successful at conquest, that's why we often give them all the credit, when in fact they're just the best at publicity, let's just put it that way. They're not necessarily the first people to come up with these ideas.
Well, thank you so much for listening, and we hope you tune in for our next podcast.
Bye.
Bye.